April 1945. A small German village called Oberdorf, 30 kilometers south of Nuremberg. The war was collapsing all around them. General George S. Patton's Third Army was rolling forward like an unstoppable steel tide. Tanks, half-tracks, and thousands of infantry moved along narrow, muddy roads lined with ruined houses and blossoming apple trees that somehow still bloomed amid the destruction and chaos. The air smelled of smoke, wet earth, gunpowder, and distant artillery fire that was slowly fading as the German army disintegrated before their eyes. At the head of the long column rode General George Patton himself, a stern-faced 60-year-old American general with a bald head, strong jawline, prominent chin, high forehead, and piercing, intense eyes. He wore his polished combat helmet with 4 stars clearly visible, a crisp uniform covered in medals, and ribbons earned through years of hard fighting, and his famous pearl-handled revolvers in their holsters. Patton stood tall in the lead jeep, one hand resting firmly on the windshield, the other close to his ivory-handled pistol. He hated waiting, he hated caution. But even the legendary general could feel that the end of the war was near, and with it came a strange mixture of triumph and exhaustion. The long column of vehicles and men slowed down suddenly. Up ahead, right in the middle of the muddy road, stood a small figure. It was a 10-year-old German boy. He was painfully thin, pale from hunger, with messy brown hair that had not been cut in months, and clothes that were far too big for his small body. In his trembling hands he held a long stick with a white bedsheet tied to the top, a makeshift white flag of surrender. The boy did not run away. He did not cry. He simply stood there bravely, blocking the path of an entire American Army division. The lead jeep stopped 10 meters away. Patton raised his hand immediately. The entire long column came to a complete halt. Engines rumbled and idle. Hundreds of soldiers leaned forward from their vehicles and tanks to see what was happening at the front. The tension in the air was thick. Patton stepped out of the jeep. His polished boots sank into the mud. He walked slowly and deliberately toward the boy. The child looked up at the tall, imposing general with the 4 stars on his helmet. The boy's voice was quiet, but surprisingly clear despite his fear. "Bitte, nicht schießen," he said in broken English mixed with German. "No shooting in the village. Only women, children, and wounded. No soldiers left, please." Patton stopped a few steps away. He looked at the boy for a long, silent moment, studying his face, his thin arms, the desperate hope in his eyes. Then the general did something no one expected. He knelt on one knee in the mud so their eyes were level. "What is your name, son?" The boy hesitated, then answered softly, "Friedrich, but everyone calls me Fritz." Patton nodded slowly. "Fritz, are you telling me the truth? There are no German soldiers in your village?" The boy shook his head firmly. "Only old men who cannot walk, and mothers with babies. My father died in Russia. My mother is sick. Please, do not destroy our homes." Behind Patton, his officers whispered urgently. Some wanted to push forward immediately. Others worried it could be a trap or an ambush. Patton raised his hand again. Complete silence fell over the column. He turned back to the boy. "Fritz, I am General George Patton. I give you my word as a soldier. We will not shoot if what you say is true. Take me to your village." The boy's eyes widened in disbelief. He had never imagined that the famous American general would actually listen to him or walk with him. Fritz turned and led the way with small, careful steps. Patton followed on foot, his pearl-handled revolvers swinging at his sides. Behind him, 2 full companies of infantry moved cautiously forward, rifles ready, but barrels pointed down toward the ground. They entered Oberdorf together. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking. Houses were half destroyed by artillery and bombing. Streets were filled with rubble, broken furniture, and scattered personal belongings. Women in torn dresses stood in doorways holding crying babies. Children, some as young as 4, stared with huge, sunken eyes full of fear and hunger. An old man with one leg missing sat on a broken bench, watching the Americans with tired resignation. Everywhere there was the quiet, heavy sound of hunger and despair. Patton walked slowly through the main street, taking in every detail. He saw no weapons, no hidden soldiers, only civilians who had been abandoned when the German army retreated in panic. He stopped in front of a small group of mothers. One woman held a baby so thin and weak it barely made a sound. Patton reached into his pocket without hesitation, took out a chocolate bar, and handed it to the nearest child. The child looked at the general as if he had given him the entire world. Patton turned to his aide. "Get the supply officer here, now." When the major arrived, Patton spoke clearly and firmly, his voice carrying across the square. "I want every available ration, K rations, D rations, anything we can spare, brought into this village immediately. Set up a distribution point in the square, twice a day until relief arrives. These people are non-combatants. They are starving. We will feed them." The major hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, regulations strictly prohibit giving army rations to German civilians. It could be seen as aiding the enemy." Patton cut him off with a sharp, piercing look that silenced him instantly. "In this sector I am the regulation. These are children and mothers. We did not cross the ocean to let them die while we have food. Make it happen." That is an order. Word spread through the long column like wildfire. Soldiers began unloading heavy crates from trucks. Canned meat, biscuits, chocolate bars, condensed milk, everything they could spare was brought forward. Women and children formed a quiet, orderly line. Fritz stood right beside Patton the entire time, translating when needed and helping the younger children. That evening, as the sun set behind the ruined church tower, casting long golden shadows over the rubble, Fritz approached Patton again. The boy held something small in his hands, a small wooden cross he had carved himself from a broken apple tree branch earlier that day. On it, he had scratched with a nail the words, "Danke, General." Fritz handed it to Patton without saying a word, his eyes full of gratitude. Patton took the cross carefully. For the first time in many long months, his hard, stern face softened visibly. He placed his large hand gently on the boy's thin shoulder. "Thank you, Fritz. You were braver than most of my soldiers today. You stopped an entire army with nothing but a white flag. That takes real courage." The boy smiled for the first time in what must have been months. Over the next 10 days, the food stations in Oberdorf became a small miracle in the middle of the dying war. Children began to gain a little weight. Their sunken eyes started to brighten. Mothers smiled again when they saw their sons and daughters eating. Fritz came every single morning and evening to help distribute the food. He became a trusted helper to the American soldiers. Patton visited the station twice more during that time, always stopping to speak with the boy and check on the civilians. On the 11th day, when the first Red Cross trucks finally arrived to take over the relief effort, Patton prepared to move his army forward once again. Fritz ran up to the general's jeep with another small gift, a simple pencil drawing of Patton standing tall with the white flag beside him. Patton folded the drawing carefully and put it inside his tunic pocket right over his heart, where it would stay for the rest of the war. Before leaving, Patton knelt once more in front of the boy. "Fritz, when you grow up, remember this. War is not won by the strongest army or the biggest guns. It is won by the people who still choose to be human when everything around them tells them not to. You taught me that today." The boy nodded, tears shining in his eyes. Patton stood up, gave the boy a final crisp salute, and climbed into his jeep. As the long column began to move out of Oberdorf, Fritz stood bravely in the middle of the road, holding his white flag high until the last truck disappeared around the bend. Years later, when Fritz, now an old man living in the rebuilt village of Oberdorf, told his grandchildren the story, he would take out a faded photograph. In it, a 10-year-old boy stands beside the most famous American general of the war. Both are smiling. Between them is a small wooden cross and a white flag. And the old man would always say the same thing with a quiet smile. That day, I learned that even the hardest general in the world could still have a heart. General Patton did not just win the war with tanks and guns. He won something much more important in that small village. He won back a little piece of humanity for all of us. The food station in Oberdorf continued for several weeks until full relief organizations arrived. Children gained weight. Mothers regained hope. The small wooden cross that Fritz gave Patton became one of the general's most treasured personal items. He kept it with Anna's letter and the child's drawing in a special box that traveled with him until the end of the war. Patton never spoke publicly about the incident in Oberdorf. To him it was a private moment between a general, a brave boy, and the conscience of an army. But those who served under him in the final days remembered the change. The Third Army advanced with the same power, but with a new sense of restraint and humanity. Prisoners were treated fairly. Civilians received help. The war ended not only with victory, but with a small measure of grace. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Patton stood on a hill watching his tanks roll toward the meeting point with the Russians. He thought of Fritz and the white flag. He thought of the letter from a German mother. And he knew that in that small village he had made one of the most important decisions of his life. Years after the war, when an old Fritz visited the grave of General George Patton in America, he placed a small white flag and a wooden cross on the headstone. He whispered, "Thank you for listening to a boy with nothing but a sheet on a stick." And somewhere in the quiet of a military cemetery, the hardest general in the American army was remembered not only for his thunderous victories, but for the day he chose mercy when the world expected ruthlessness. Years later, when Fritz, now an old man living in the rebuilt village of Oberdorf, told his grandchildren the story around the dinner table, he would take out a faded, carefully preserved photograph from a wooden box. In it, a 10-year-old boy with messy brown hair stands proudly beside the most famous American general of the war. Both are smiling under the spring sun. Between them is a small handmade wooden cross and a white flag tied to a stick. The grandchildren would listen with wide eyes as their grandfather spoke, and the old man would always say the same thing, with a quiet, warm smile in his voice. That day, I learned that even the hardest general in the world could still have a heart. General Patton did not just win the war with tanks and guns and brilliant strategy. He won something much more important in that small, ruined village. He won back a little piece of humanity for all of us. He showed me that even in the middle of the worst war in history, one man could choose kindness when everything around him demanded revenge. The food station in Oberdorf continued operating for several more weeks until full international relief organizations with trucks and supplies finally arrived to take over. During those days, children slowly gained weight. Their sunken eyes started to brighten again. Mothers began to smile when they saw their sons and daughters eating real meals. Fritz came every single morning and evening without fail to help the American soldiers distribute the food. He became a trusted helper and a bridge between the villagers and the soldiers. Patton visited the station twice more during that time, always stopping to speak personally with the boy, check on the civilians, and make sure everything was running smoothly. On the 11th day, when the first Red Cross trucks finally rolled into the village to take over the relief effort, Patton prepared to move his entire army forward once again toward the final objectives. Fritz ran up to the general's jeep one last time. He was holding another small personal gift, a simple pencil drawing he had made of Patton standing tall with the white flag beside him and children around them. Patton folded the drawing carefully with great respect and put it inside his tunic pocket right over his heart, where it would stay with him for the rest of the war and beyond. Before leaving, Patton knelt once more in the mud in front of the boy. He looked Fritz straight in the eyes and spoke with quiet sincerity. "Fritz, when you grow up, remember this lesson for the rest of your life. War is not won by the strongest army or the biggest guns or the cleverest generals. It is won by the people who still choose to be human when everything around them tells them not to. You taught me that today with nothing but a white sheet on a stick. Never forget your own courage." The boy nodded, tears shining in his eyes, but a proud smile on his face. Patton stood up slowly, gave the boy a final crisp military salute, and climbed into his jeep. As the long column began to move out of Oberdorf, Fritz stood bravely and straight in the middle of the road, holding his white flag high above his head until the very last truck disappeared around the distant bend in the road. The war ended soon after. Patton's army played a key role in the final victory, but in the small village of Oberdorf, the memory of the general who stopped for a boy with a white flag lived on for generations. Years later, when an old Fritz visited the grave of General George Patton in America as a grown man, he placed a small white flag and a carefully carved wooden cross on the headstone. He whispered softly, "Thank you for listening to a scared boy with nothing but a sheet on a stick. You showed me that even the hardest men can choose mercy." And somewhere in the quiet of a military cemetery under the American sun, the general who was known as Old Blood and Guts was remembered not only for his thunderous victories and bold commands, but for the day he chose to stop an entire army for a child and feed a hungry village when the world expected only conquest.